page 3a. So Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchok. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchok says, halacha. The halacha is tzricha shetehei. You need there to be machzekes roishei v'rubai v'shulchanai. That a sukkah needs to have 7 by 7. Has to be able to hold the head, the majority of the body, and the table. Amar Rav Abba. Rav Abba says, "Come on, who does this go like? Kibei Shammai? Are you paskening like Beis Shammai?" And the Gemara answers, Amar Le, Ela Kaman. So the small Bar Yitzchok says, who else? In other words, yes, yeah, I'm passing like Beis Shammai. Who else would I? Who else holds this? Ika Diami, and some say a little different version. Amar Rav Abba. Rav Abba said, the Amalach Mani. If someone asks you who you're holding like, what would you say? Who are you paskening like? You said that you need to have Roisha Rubav Shachanai, that you need to fit in a sukkah. Minimum sukkah size sukkah is basically 7 by 7 to handle person's head, majority of his body, and his table. So who said, if someone asks you who you're paskening like, who would you say? Amar Le, he said to him, Beis Shammai, this is the halal, this is the opinion of Beis Shammai. And don't turn from this. This is the halacha, even though normally we paskin like Beis Hillel, but here we're paskin like Beis Shammai. So the difference between the two statements is the first one seems to be that Reb Abba knew about Beis Shammai. Second one, he didn't really know about Beis Shammai, and the reason is possibly because, as we'll soon see, the Mishnah that talks about the opinion of Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, it's not so clear if that Mishnah is talking about the minimum size of a sukkah, or maybe it's talking about a regular sukkah that's not minimum size, and it just deals with having your table in your sukkah. Is that a problem if it's outside the sukkah? Does it need to be in the sukkah? And that could be what the Mishnah is talking about. And so the second version of this discussion, the second version of Reb Shmuel Bar Yitzchok's and Reb Abba's dialogue, is assuming that Reb Abba did not know that Beis Shammai talks about a minimum size sukkah, and therefore he asked, like, who do you hold? Who are you following? Where are you getting this halacha from? And on this, Shmuel Bar Yitzchok said that Beis Shammai also holds here, even by minimum size. He also holds about this concept of needs to fit a table and fit the person in the sukkah with the majority of his body. And so ultimately it's 7 by 7, and that is Beis Shammai's view also in the case of the minimum size sukkah. And Reb Abba did not know that because he thought that the Mishnah was only talking about the regular sukkah or the big sukkah, and not about minimum size. Okay. Anyway, so that's basically these two versions, which basically says that we paskin like Beis Shammai, which is an interesting thing. Normally we don't follow Beis Shammai, but Tosfos over here talks about the 6 cases where we follow Beis Shammai. He brings them down on the left side, on the Tosfos over here on page 3a, the second Tosfos. So there are obviously a number of cases where we do follow Beis Shammai as Tosfos goes through. Okay, so the Gemara continues and says, Maskit la Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok asked the question on Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchok, who said that the size of a minimum sukkah is 7 by 7, and the Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok says, but I have a problem with that because the Mishnah doesn't necessarily say that. So he says, Mimai, the Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, how do you know that the argument of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is talking about minimum size sukkah? Maybe they're arguing about a big sukkah. Maybe they're talking about a big sukkah. Pigain, for example, the Yosef Apuma de Matalalta, that a person is sitting. Yosef means sitting. Apuma on the edge, literally on the lip of the Metalalta of the sukkah. Metalalta is like Aramaic for sukkah. So maybe he's sitting on the edge of the sukkah. And his table is inside the house. The Beis Shammai Sabri, Beis Shammai holds goes Rino and Shami Shulchan. And Beis Shammai says that we're afraid that he might actually lean after his table, and because of that, Beis Shammai says that you're not allowed to eat in a sukkah that has the table by the, in the house, because we're afraid you're going to end up leaning towards your table, and you'll end up eating inside the house instead of in the sukkah. Now, the truth of the matter is, when I thought about this, this is a very practical case. A lot of people have overhangs, and people sometimes make like a kiddush. I've seen in a shul even where they have a kiddush, and they have an overhang, and they put the tables there for the buffet, because you can't really eat there, but the buffet table is there. So I have to look it up in Shulchan Aruch what would be the halacha there, especially if we follow Beis Shammai in this case. It seems that we do. I think Shulchan Aruch does pass them like Beis Shammai. So the only thought I have is that that's a table that's not used for sitting at. It's people maybe stand near it, but they don't sit there and then maybe lean forward. Although I don't know if it's so. My thought is that it could be problematic. I'm specifically thinking about a certain shul in Florida where they have a overhang, and they put their buffet table over there. Interesting question. I have to look in Shulchan Aruch, see if any place can talk about it. In other words, there might be room to be lenient. There's two reasons why I think maybe you could be lenient. One of them is, first of all, there's other views about the big sukkah, and second of all, in other words, there's room to say that maybe we don't follow Beis Shammai about the big sukkah, only about a small sukkah. But second of all, even if we follow Beis Shammai about the big sukkah, maybe there's a difference between a table that you sit at and a table that is just there for buffet purposes. So anyway, that's just a thought. But in any event, it could be very practical. Okay, so the bottom line is we have here Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok is trying to ask a question on Reb Shmuel bar Yitzchok. And he's saying that, how do you know that Beis Shammai is even talking about a small sukkah? I think maybe he's just talking about a big sukkah where you have a table in your house, and Beis Shammai says that you cannot eat inside such a sukkah. It's not a kosher sukkah, because we're afraid the rabbis made a decree that you might end up leaning and eating inside the house. And therefore, because of this gzeira, and this is an interesting point, because of this decree, it turns out that even biblically you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah. That's a surprising law, that the rabbi's decree causes you to even biblically not fulfill the mitzvah. But that's one of the understandings. Tosfos over here seems to follow that understanding, that biblically you don't fulfill the mitzvah by a big sukkah, according to Beis Shammai, because there's a decree that you can't, not to dwell in such a sukkah, because we're afraid you will end up leaning over the table. Now, Beis Hillel sabri legazrinan, shalei gazrinan. Beis Hillel holds that we don't make such a decree. Now, there are other opinions here that say that there are other opinions that argue with Tosfos and say that you only lose the mitzvah rabbinically, but not biblically, which seems more logical, that the rabbis would make a decree that would cause you rabbinically not to fulfill the mitzvah, but biblically, of course, you ate in a sukkah. We're just afraid that you're going to lean towards the table and end up eating more in the house than in the sukkah, and that would be, of course, a problem if you did that. But the decree that maybe you're going to do that would be a rabbinic decree that would say you should not be eating in such a sukkah that has a table that's right by the entrance, and you might lean towards it and end up eating in the house. Okay, so bottom line is we have we have an argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about this big sukkah. And where's Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchok coming along and saying that, guess what? On a minimum size sukkah, it has to fit your head, your majority of your body, and your table. Because of Beis Shammai says that. Beis Shammai says that. Beis Shammai is talking about a big sukkah that you have to have your table in the sukkah. He's not saying about a small sukkah that it has to fit your table. He's saying that therefore the size is 7 by 7. Saying a big sukkah that you have a table by the entrance. Beis Shammai says that's a problem. That's what he's saying. But Dekanami, and I'll even tell you that the text seems to be more. The grammar fits better with learning it this way. Diktani, because it says in that Mishnah, if a person has his head and majority of his body in the sukkah, but his table is b'seichabayis inside the house. Beis Shammai says that it is invalid, and Beis Hillel says it's kosher. Now, what do we see from here? Shane Chavi's going to give me. I'm in the middle of my shear. Do you want to sit with me? Give her the shear. Can't touch anything, okay? You just sit nicely. Okay. So the Gemara continues. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok explains that it's actually meduyek. It's also meduyek. It fits better the wording because it talks about what happens if a person is sitting in a sukkah, a person that has his head and majority of his body in the sukkah, but his table is in the house. Now, if you want to tell me that the sukkah is invalid, then you should say about a sukkah that, is a minimum size sukkah, it should say that does your sukkah hold? Does it have enough room for a table or just yourself and majority of your body? It shouldn't say a person who's sitting in the sukkah, but his table is in the house. It should talk about the sukkah being big enough to handle it. So v'im isa, and if you want to tell me like you're explaining Reb Shmuel bar Yitzchok, if you want to say that talking about a minimum size sukkah, machzekas ve'ena machzekas mibayla, it should talk about containing a table. If the sukkah can contain a table or cannot contain such a table because of its minimum size. Miboile, that's what it needs to say. Why is it talking about the person? If the person is sitting in the sukkah at his table, it must be talking about a regular size sukkah. And it's not about the sukkah being kosher, it's about the situation that his table's in the house. He might end up eating partially in the house. But a minimum size sukkah, we don't have clarity on Beis Shammai's opinion about such a law. We don't know what the halacha would be. So that's Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok's question to Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchok. Now, the Gemara says that Ubasukkah katana like pligi, and are they not arguing about a small sukkah? Meaning, the Gemara is now asking a question on Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok that really they don't argue about a minimum size sukkah. Well, Tanya, but we have a brisa. So the Mishnah was a little unclear. The brisa says, what does the brisa say? Machzekes. We have a brisa. It says machzekes rosh rubai v'shulchanai kshera. If the sukkah can contain, it's big enough to contain. If it's big enough to contain a person's head, his majority of his body, and his table, kshera, it is kosher. And that's the first opinion. It doesn't say a name, but we have an opinion that says that the sukkah has to contain person's head, majority of his body, in his table. And we have another opinion, Rebbe Yomer, and we've seen Rebbe's opinion before. Rebbe says, arba amais, till you have 4 amais by 4 amais. You need to have a sukkah. A sukkah needs to be big. Rebbe holds that a sukkah has to be more like a house, right? It has to be similar. There has to be more permanent. It has to be 4 by 4, and that was Rebbe's view. And 4 cubits by 4 cubits. And the other opinion said, no, basically 7 by 7. The head, majority of the body, and the table, which is 7 by 7. That's good enough. Then the Gemara brings another brisa. V'tanya idach, we have a second brisa. What does the second brisa say? The second brisa says that Rebbe, what the second brayso says, Rebbe says, Kol sukkah shein ba'arba ames al arba ames psula. If a sukkah doesn't have 4 by 4 cubits, it is invalid, which is this opinion of Rebbe, which we just saw. And the next thing is the other opinion. The other opinion is that the Chachamim, the rabbis say, afilu eina machzekes ala reishei v'rubai ksheira, even if it can only handle person's head and majority of his body. It doesn't even say table here. Here it just says the head and the majority of the body, which we're going to assume means like 6 hand breaths instead of 7 hand breaths. Now, the ilu shulchanei like katani, but it doesn't even say table here. So how do we handle these two? We have the rabbi's view, and one brisa says it needs to contain the table as well. It needs to be big enough to hold the table. In the second brisa says it doesn't need to be big enough to contain the table, just to contain the person's head and majority of his body. So the Gemara says, Kashin Adodi. It seems to be a question on each other if we're assuming it's the same view. Rebbe and this rabbinic view, the Rebbe is one view, and the rabbis is the other view. And the rabbi's view seems to be contradicted one brisa to the other brisa. Elalav shmamina. Rather, we must hear from this Beis Shammai, that this is Beis Shammai and this is Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel.
Right.
And so here, yes.
That means with mentioning the table as Beis Shammai, not mentioning the table as Beis Hillel.
Correct. That the Beis Shammai, who's more machmir, says the sukkah needs to be big enough to contain a table that's 7 tefachim, and the Beis Hillel would say the sukkah needs to be big enough even without the table, but the body and the majority of the body and the head, that's 6 tefachim, 6 hand.
And the other distinction is that Rebbe says pasula. He uses the word that's in the Mishnah.
And what do you see from that?
Before, we had a long discussion about calling something pasul and not saying change it, lower it, lift it.
Mm-hmm.
So usually we didn't have anybody use that word. Only the Mishnah used that word. Pasul.
Right. The thing is that the Mishnah mentioned psula or a way of correcting it.
Right.
So you're wondering why the brisa here, maybe the brisa also should have said fix it, make it bigger.
Since it's Rebbe, he's the author of a compiler of a lot of the Mishnahs, right? So I'm thinking maybe he has maybe a little bit more authority. I don't know.
Well, according to the reasons that we had before, that when it's biblical, you say puzzle, so then that fits with this idea that it should say puzzle. According to the other reason, that if it gets too complicated, if it says how to fix it,
right.
So maybe here also you could say that if it's Rebbe would have to say that Rebbe would say a sukkah that doesn't have 4 by 4.
Right, he doesn't advocate the smaller
sukkah. Fix it, and the rabbis say it needs to only have that. So you can maybe say fix it, make it bigger. Make it bigger, yeah. I guess it could have said that in the brisa. That's an interesting point. Like, why doesn't the brisa say such a thing? Make it bigger. Could just say sukkah that doesn't have 4 by 4, yigadla or something. Yarichai, make it more lengthy. Make it more. Doesn't have 4 by 4. The only thing that I'm thinking is maybe it still would take, since there's a view that a sukkah needs to be exactly for length and 4 width. And if it was a little less on one direction, but more in the other direction, that's a problem. And it could be that Rebbe, it seems that Rebbe holds that way, that's the view of Rebbe. Now, if so, it would not be able to get away with one word. If it said a sukkah that doesn't have 4 by 4, it would have to say Ya'arichoi ve'yarchivoi. It would have to say both. So maybe psula is shorter. So because it would need to clarify that point that you need to have both directions, maybe that would be a good reason why.
Yeah, okay, I understand. But certainly he seems to hold that it would not be valid just to have a sukkah that held your head.
Right, for sure. Right, and if you remember, we've gone over Rebbe's view a number of times over these past 9 pages, because we have that round sukkah that needed to handle 24 people around it, or so he definitely did not go for a small sukkah.
Yeah, my guess is he also would think when he says 4 by 4, he really means 4 walls.
Well, 4 walls, it doesn't say.
No, but it's sort of, in my mind, I get that picture immediately when I'm from his.
The problem is there's a halacha l'moshe Sinai that says that you don't need 4 walls. It's a little hard for him to argue on that.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so yeah, but we'll soon see what this let's talk out now. Actually, what is this argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? So basically, we've now concluded. Shma Mina, the Gemara said. We hear from this that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel hold that a small sukkah needs to have there's a minimum size. Beis Shammai is the 7 tefachim, Beis Hillel is 6 tefachim. It has to do with the size, how much does your table also need to be in the sukkah. And Rebbe holds 4 by 4. So what does it boil down to? What is the source of this argument? Where do they get their opinion from? So basically, it says Basukos Teishvu Shivas Yamim. You have to dwell in the sukkah for 7 days. Now, Beis Shammai holds, what is dwelling? Dwelling, similar to the way you would live in your house, it needs to have place for sitting and eating. Sitting and eating are important parts of dwelling.
But apparently he doesn't hold that you have to sleep in it.
Well, it doesn't. Interesting. It's a little unclear how that works. Like, how do they really sleep in such a sukkah? I mean, but maybe the way they would recline, they could sleep. I'm not exactly sure, because the 7 tefachim seem to be, involved the sitting in a reclining way. So I'm not exactly sure.
Yes, I agree with you about the reclining, but the feet are in the house.
Right, but
it's in the doorway.
It seems to be okay. It seems to be okay, even though your feet are not in the sukkah when you're sleeping. Just like when you're eating, your feet don't need to be in your sukkah.
Right.
Which is a very interesting question, actually, that we normally say, and at least in the midrashic, in the drushim of the different insights into sukkahs, that one of the main concepts of the sukkah is that your whole body is enveloped in a sukkah, but that's not exactly true, because your feet are allowed to be out of the sukkah. Not only that, but think about when you're sitting in a sukkah and there's a table. Where are your feet when there's a table?
Under the table where there's no sukkah.
Under the table. So seemingly, you're not exactly inside, your whole body is not inside the sukkah. So how do we, you have different, all these, insights about the uniqueness of the mitzvah of sukkah. It entails your whole body. And everything that you're doing there is a mitzvah. And
I taught my kids, it's only like a mikvah.
Like a mikvah, right. Even more than a mikvah, because a mikvah just purifies your body, gives you a little spirituality. But the sukkah, everything you do inside it becomes a mitzvah, and it becomes holy.
So we have to understand. We have to understand that their tables were different from our tables. So you can recline in the small sukkah, and you just have a little stand next to you. That's the table. It's not a big table with legs. It's just a small.
Yeah. No, they had a ledge. It was a ledge the size of a tefach, a handbreadth. That's all it is. Yeah.
But of course, for Pesach, they tell you how they take it away. They put it back. So it could be just a small stand where you could fit a plate or utensils like a fork.
Yeah, I don't even know how they could fit a plate in a handbreadth, but that seems like, I think on Pesach maybe they built themselves bigger tables because this table for the sukkah, I don't think we would be able to handle a Seder plate. It's good for a sukkah.
Well, the servants brought around the Seder plate the way that's described. They brought the Seder plate and brought it to the Baal Habayis, and he took out what he needed. They probably have to stand for that, but for his own meal, he has to have his own. Where he's dipping and it's dripping. Anyhow, I think we have to really condition ourselves to think about each of these people is thinking about a different conception of a construction.
All right. Well, in any event, let me just finish my train of thought. So
Thank you.
The concept of dwelling in a sukkah, according to Beis Shammai, is you need to be able to eat in it. According to Beis Hillel, it really just involves teishvu. Basukkah teishvu, you just got to sit in it, not eating, and therefore they don't hold that it needs to have a table. You need to sit in it. Basukkah teishvu shivas yamim. And Rebbe holds that it needs to be mamish like a house, like a bias. And similar to the rules of a house, which we'll soon see about a bias needs to have 4x4. He holds that a sukkah's kei, teishvu kei taduru, just like you live in your house. A house is not a house unless it has 4 amos by 4 amos, 4 cubits by 4 cubits. So also the sukkah needs to have 4 cubits by 4 cubits. So it comes out that you have these 3 opinions based on this concept of teishvu, dwelling in the sukkah. I'm sharing with you what the commentaries explain. It's not my own insight. But this is the understanding that the sukkah needs to be somehow similar to your dwelling, but to what extent?
Oh,
yes.
So the Gemara continues and says, Amar Mar Zutra Masisanami Daika. The Mishnah is also meduyat. It also the wording of the Mishnah also implies this from the grammar of from the wording and the what is the wording in the Mishnah? Midaktani, because the Mishnah says Beis Shammai poislan v'sel machshirin, that Beis Shammai holds it's invalid and Beis Hillel says it's kosher. V'misa, and if it's true that they're arguing about a big sukkah, if they're only arguing about a big sukkah, then the proper thing to say would be, did you fulfill the mitzvah or not? The sukkah is a kosher sukkah. It's not poislin or machshirin. They're not saying the sukkah is invalid. It's a big sukkah. The problem was that your table is in your house, or by the edge, by your and not in the sukkah. And so the problem with what you're doing is eating by the edge. Your sukkah is a kosher sukkah. It's you're eating your situation. Maybe you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of eating in a sukkah because of the possibility that you might have leaned over and the rabbis prohibited you eating in that way. But they don't, it's not about the sukkah being puzzle, being invalid. So the Gemara says, V'im Isa, if it's so that they're arguing about a big sukkah, not about a small sukkah, but about a big one, Beis Shammai yomrim lo yotza, Beis Hillel yomrim yotza mi boiled. It should have said that Beis Shammai says you did not fulfill your mitzvah, and Beis Hillel says you did fulfill the mitzvah. That's what they should be arguing about. Why does the Mishnah say puzzle in kosher? They must be talking about the minimum size sukkah. Because if you're talking about a big sukkah, it would be all about if you fulfilled the mitzvah of eating in the sukkah or not. Vela kasha misha haya. The beginning of the Mishnah says a little differently. that it implies it's talking about a big sukkah, and it talks about a person that was in the sukkah. Did he fulfill the mitzvah or not? So the beginning of the mission implies it's talking about the person, not about the sukkah. And which if it was talking about the sukkah, it should say machzekes, right? It should say if the sukkah can hold, not about if the person ate in the sukkah. Talking about the sukkah, this is being a kosher sukkah. On the other hand, when it talks about the final law in that Mishnah, it says puzzle or kosher, which seem like it's talking about the sukkah and not about the person. And so the beginning of the Mishnah talks about the person, the end of the Mishnah talks about the sukkah. So the Gemara says, you know what? Really, they're arguing about both. The big sukkah, which deals with the person fulfilling the mitzvah, the small sukkah, which deals with the sukkah being a kosher sukkah or not, that they're arguing about both cases. Betarti pligi b'sukkah katana, upligi b'sukkah gedayla. They're arguing about these two sukkahs, the small sukkah, the big sukkah. And really, the Mishnah is missing words. The hachi katani, and this is what it means to say. This is what it should have said. Mishaya Reisha Ruba sukkah, if a person's head and majority of his body are in a sukkah, meaning a big sukkah, but his table is by his house, is right next to the sukkah, but not under the schach of the sukkah. It's inside the house. Beis Shammai says you did not fulfill the mitzvah. Beis Hillel says you did fulfill the mitzvah. Now, this is the argument about a big sukkah. And if it can only handle your head and the majority of your body, it doesn't have room for your table. On that is another argument. Beis Shammai says it is puzzle, invalid, the sukkah, because it's too small. Beis Hillel says it's good enough. You can sit in it. You can't eat in it. You don't have a table, but you can sit in it. So it's good enough. Hold your sandwich.
Well, yeah, right. Exactly. You could drink your soup.
Yeah. So therefore, there's an argument about both cases. Now, what is the reason that, according to Beis Shammai, the big sukkah is not good enough? So the reason for the big sukkah not being good enough is because we're afraid you're going to lean after your table. That's the reason for Beis Shammai by a big sukkah. Now, what's the reason for a small sukkah according to Beis Shammai? Seemingly the reason is because it's too small. It's like a dira strucha. It's considered like a disgusting dwelling. It's an uncomfortable dwelling. It's a inappropriate dwelling. It's not a normal dwelling. Now, that would mean that the reasons for both of these cases are different. In other words, Beis Shammai has a reason for the big sukkah having to do with being, we're nervous that he'll lean and eat inside the house. The reason for the small sukkah is that it's a dira srucha, it's too small. Now, another way of understanding this is that by a small sukkah, because there's no room for your table, we're afraid that you're going to lean or go into your house. You're going to end up not eating in the sukkah, and you'll lean towards your house. That's another way of learning it. Now, if you learn that way, that because there's no room for your table in the sukkah, so that would end up meaning that both have the same reason. A big sukkah, we're afraid you're going to lean towards your table because the table's outside of the sukkah. And the same thing as a small sukkah that doesn't have a table. We're afraid you'll put a table by the edge and you'll end up eating by the table. So it's basically the same reason. Now, if you take this a step further, what would be the halacha here? So Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchok just told us that the halacha is that the minimum size sukkah is 7 by 7 because it has to handle the table. Now, if the reason for the minimum size sukkah is the same as the big sukkah, so then when he paskins that the minimum size sukkah is Beis Shammai, so the same law would apply to the big sukkah because it's the same reason.
Yeah.
But if you hold that the reason of the small sukkah is different than the big sukkah, so then we could pass in like Beis Shammai regarding a small sukkah, but we might be able to say that the halacha by a big sukkah is different because of a different reason. The small sukkah is too small; it's not a normal dwelling. But a big sukkah, it's a different reason. It has to do with are we afraid? So then you might be able to say that the halacha is different. So that's why there's room to argue and say maybe by a big that was what I was mentioning earlier, that maybe there's room to argue, even though I believe Shulchan Aruch says that we follow the Beis Shammai in both, but there are other Rishonim that say that the halacha follows Beis Hillel regarding a big sukkah. Regarding a small sukkah, we have Reb Shmuel by Yitzchok here that says in that the halacha is that it's minimum size sukkah is Beis Shammai. We had those two versions. Okay, so anyway, that takes it to the halacha level. Now the Gemara says, "Man tana laha the tana rabbanan." Oh, before I say this, I just want to mention that we mentioned, I believe we mentioned it when we learned it, that when it talks about chasurim mechsura, that the Mishnah is missing words, what that means is, there's a discussion of what that exactly means. One understanding of the Mishnah missing words means that the Mishnah is taught to the scholars or the people who are learning it in a way that it's meant for you to understand things in a hint. And not that the Mishnah is actually missing words. It's supposed to be that way. Rebbe taught it that way. And you see that he actually hinted certain things in that Mishnah. Like one of the parts of the Mishnah talked about the person. The other part of the Mishnah talked about the sukkah being valid or invalid. So you sort of see from there, it was like hinted to you that, so it's not that we're supposed to add words to the Mishnah. It's the meaning is that Rebbe taught it to us in more of a cryptic codified way, where you have to decipher the code of the Mishnah. And my understanding is that it's because Rebbe wanted you to learn it with the teacher, and he didn't want you to think that you could just, open it up and figure out your own things, and then you'll end up possibly learning things wrong. You need to have a teacher in order to get things more correct. Now, the other way of understanding Chasuri Mechsura is that people started forgetting the actual laws and the exact wording of certain Mishnahs. However, Rebbe, when he gathered all the Mishnayos, he didn't fix it. He kept it the way it was, and that was the way people remembered it. That was the normal text that people had, even though it was a little mistaken because of over time, people had forgotten some of the exact wording, but Rebbe left it that way, and he didn't fix it. He just wrote the Mishnah the way it was commonly repeated, and he assumed that the person who learns it will understand that that you have to change it around. So in other words, it was worded that way because of a forgetfulness. This is another way of understanding Chasuri Mechsura. That whenever the Gemara often tells us about Chasuri Mechsura, that there's words missing in the Mishnah, so it either means that it's not that there are words missing, it was done purposefully, learned this way, or it was mistakenly happened this way because of forgetfulness. But Rebbe, when he wrote the Mishnah, he wrote it the way people were repeating the Mishnah in his day, the common understanding. And basically people had to, even though they forgot the exact wording, but he expected people to figure it out based on other knowledge of other Mishnayos, or maybe even might find certain hints in the wording, but ultimately you'll figure out what the correct version is. So anyway, that's the understanding of Chasuri Mechsura. Okay, now comes the next Gemara. Who's the author of the following brisa? A house that does not have 4 amais by 4 amais. Many laws apply to this house. Potter. Let me mute everyone here.
I think you're going to say.
Okay. Okay. So let's continue. So a house that doesn't have 4 cubits by 4 cubits is exempt from many laws. Pater min hamezuzah, it's exempt from a mezuzah. Umin hamaikim, from a mica. First of all, it doesn't just mean a house; it means even a room that doesn't have 4 by 4. It's exempt. Also, it's pater from a mica. Mica is the roof, having a fence around the roof. The mica is the fence that goes around the flat roof in order that people don't fall. So if the house doesn't have 4 by 4, so then the roof would be exempt from a fence around it. And seemingly the reason would be that such a house is not a real house. It's not permanent, and no one's going to be walking on the roof. Or maybe something along those lines, and therefore it will be exempt from the mitzvah of Micah. Of course, the reason, the literal, the main reason that it's exempt is because it says bias. But question would be, why would you be exempt, even though it says bias? But we do learn that things that are dangerous are also prohibited. So it would fall under another category, even though it says the word bias there. The thing is that probably such a house, such a situation would not be a type of a place where people would even walk because it's so tiny. But anyway, or maybe it's not even strong enough. But a house that doesn't have 4 by 4 is exempt from the fence around the roof. And it also does not become tameh with saras, meaning that there's laws if the walls of a house have a certain discoloration on it. There are rules if that's considered saras or not. And a house that doesn't have 4 by 4 cubits is exempt from the laws of tumas batim, of the tuma of houses. It also is not. It's not nechlat. It doesn't become permanently sold when you sell it as a ancestral property. If it doesn't have 4 cubits by 4 cubits, it doesn't have the rule of a house inside a walled city that you only have a year to redeem it, and afterwards, if you don't redeem it, it becomes the owner or the person who bought it owns it forever. So that law doesn't apply to a house that doesn't have dalid al dalid 4 cubits by 4 cubits. Person built such a house that doesn't have 4 cubits, he would be exempt. He would not be exempt from fighting in the war. Normally, you build a new house, you're exempt. You return home from the war because you have to go home, and you just built this house. We let you enjoy it, so to speak, and inaugurate it, so to speak. A person who built this house, it's not considered a real house. You don't get to go back. You're not exempted. Now, ve'in ma'arvin by, you don't make ve'in ma'arvin by, you don't make an eruv. What does that mean? That it doesn't need to be participate in the eruv when the courtyard members, each house that's in the courtyard, they have to join together for to make the eruv, and they each give generally it's done with a matzah. Every person gives one matzah, and they put it together, and they put it in a vessel, and they put it inside one of the houses. So this house that doesn't have daled al daled, it's so tiny, it's not really livable. So it comes out that it is exempt from giving the bread or the matzah for this eruv.
A tom-tom cracker is enough.
Really? Is that
No, I'm saying it doesn't have to give challah. I was just never mind.
Yeah, no, I said a matzah.
That size, you can give a cracker. That's right. No.
But I think it has to be a certain amount, like a kazayas.
Right.
Each one, I think a kazayas, maybe kabetza. No, probably kazayas. Yeah. So anyway, the thing is that this house doesn't have to participate. And the same thing applies when the courtyards join together for be able to walk from one courtyard to the next, and they join together when they're in the same alley. They're all the courtyards of one alley, so it's called the shitufei mavuos. So this house that has a courtyard to it, That's that one doesn't have to participate in the shitufim of all the chatzeros. In other words, this house with its courtyard is exempt from participating.
Is the shear for the courtyard related to the house, or can it be a size? You can have a courtyard of any size then connected to a house that small? Or
Yes.
is it, I know the halach is like when you're measuring out what the division is of the house, you get one per doorway or something. So what
I'm not 100% sure the laws of Eruvin, but I believe it doesn't matter how big the chutzner is. This one is exempt.
All right.
It's as if no one dwells in it. So it doesn't ruin the other chatzeros from carrying. Now, of course, if there was a bigger house in this courtyard, then it would be a problem, and of course the other house has to give. But here, if it's only one house that's less than dalet al dalet, it would be exempt. Now the Mishnah, the Brisa continues, says vein manichin by eruv. You don't even put an eruv inside this house when you gather the matzahs together, and they put it in one of the houses in the courtyard. And this house you can't put it in because it's not a real house. And this was a little complicated, where you have two cities. This house is in between the two cities, and we wanted to join them together to be considered that your dwelling, where is your location of dwelling? So it's going to be in this ibur, in this pregnancy of the two cities. So again, you have two cities, they're near each other, and in between them, there's each one has, we give them 70 and in a fraction of cubits. So each one gets 70 and a fraction, and altogether there's 140, maybe 141 and a fraction together amos in between the two cities. So the problem is the person doesn't want to. The person needs to go somewhere on Shabbos, but he's limited because he only has 2,000 amos that he could walk. So the law is that if there is such a house in the middle of these two cities, so it's possible. Again, it's 70 and 2/3 amma, which means altogether there's 141 and 1/3 amma. So the thing is that if a person is there in the beginning of Shabbos, so if there's a house in between the two, we consider it all like it's all part of his city. They're all like one city, and he would be allowed to walk outside the city's 2,000 amos. Now, this house that doesn't have 4x4 ruins it. It doesn't work. It doesn't allow you to add them together, join them together to make them into one city. But that's the thing. If it would be 4x4, you would be able to actually consider them one city. Now, the brothers don't divide such a small, when they inherit such a house that's 4x4, they don't divide it. The Gemara says, "Lema Rebihi." Let's say that all of these views, all of these statements, this brisa must be the opinion of Rebbe, because we find by Sukkah he holds a Sukkah needs to be 4x4. The Gemara says, and V'loy Rabbanan, maybe the rabbis disagree with this whole brisa. Afilu Tema Rabbanan, the Gemara says you can even say that it fits with the rabbis. Ad kan lekam Rabbanan Hasam. Till now, we only said that the rabbis hold over there by a sukkah, Elinyan sukkah, only regarding a sukkah, the diras arahi, that's supposed to be a temporary dwelling, and it could be even 7x7. Aval gabi bias, but regarding a house, diras kevahi, that it's a permanent dwelling. Afilu Rabbanan moidu. Even the rabbis agree. It's not like this is the opinion of Rebbe. This is everyone. Everyone holds this way. The ES Bay Arbamis al Arbamis Dari Bayinshi. If there's 4x4 cubits, the people will live there. Beloy like Dari Bayinshi. If it doesn't have that size, people don't stand a normal dwelling, and you can't call it a house, and it doesn't fall into all these rules. Okay, now continue the Gemara. The Gemara says, Amar Mar, master said, Pater ben mezuzah, it's exempt from mezuzah. Now we're going to say the reason. What's the reason? Why is it exempt? But we're going to put a few together. Pater ben mezuzah, min micah, from the fence around the flat roof. It doesn't get tame with the tzaras, with the leprosy of the house, because it's too small. It doesn't get sold permanently with the normal rules of the house of ancestral property. Ancestral property in a walled city, I should add. It doesn't fall into the category of a house of ancestral property in a walled city. Now, you don't go back from the war in order to enjoy your house that you just built because it's such a small house. My time. What's the reason of all these? But bias because it says the word bias. Like for mezuzah, it says the mezuzah of your house, the doorpost of your house. It has to be a house. If it's less than 4 by 4 cubits, it's not called a house. And the same thing is the fence around the flat roof. Kisivna bias chadash. When you build a new house, you have to make a Michael Gagecha. And the same thing applies that to the Negoyim, to the leprosy. Uba Shalai Habayas, the house, it constantly says near Kenegalir, nearly Baboya. It says all these, and the same thing applies to ancestral property, the house inside the walled city. Yimkar base Moishav Irchem. When a person sells a house of dwelling inside a city of a walled city. And the same thing applies to the going back from war. What does it say there? It says, Asher bana bayis chadash v'loi chanachoi. He built a new house and he didn't wasn't mechanechet. I don't know what the best word for that, but I use the word inaugurated. I don't know, maybe there's a better word for that. But okay, so anyway, the reason for all these is that it's not called a house. Now comes the next cases. Vein ma'arben boy, vein mishtatin boy. You don't need to give an eruv. You don't need to participate in the eruv, and you don't need to participate in the shituf. The eruv is for to be able to carry in the courtyard, in between the houses of one courtyard. And the shituf is to be able to carry between different courtyards, from one house to the other in different courtyards and through the alley. So the house that doesn't have dalet al dalet, that doesn't 4 by 4, doesn't need to participate in the shituf of mavuis. And you don't put an eruv inside when you collect the food, the matzahs for the eruv. You don't put it in this house. My time, what's the reason? Loichazi ladira, that it's not, because it's not fit for dwelling. And the whole point over here of these type of eruvs is about dwelling, that it's a place of dwelling. If it's not a place of dwelling, then it's not part of the doesn't need to participate in the eruv. Okay, then comes the next thing. So it says eruve chatzeros in manicham bay. You don't put inside for eruve chatzeros. You don't put it. Aval shituf manicham bay. Aval shituf manicham bay. Actually, it's a statement. But shituf but to be able to carry from one courtyard, from one house in one courtyard to another house in a different courtyard, for the shituf mavois, that you could actually stick inside this house that's not dalet al dalet, right? It only said one statement, ein ma'arven bay, ein manichan bay eruv. I mean, it doesn't say ein manichan bay shituf. It says ein manichan bay eruv. That means only for the one courtyard, the different houses in the courtyard, you don't put the box of matzah in this person's house that's only 3 cubits by 3 cubits. You don't put it in there. But what about inside this person's house that's 3 cubits by 3 cubits for a shituf mavois? When they join together the many courtyards around a alley, so they would join together. Can you put it inside this house? Yes. My time. What's the reason? It's no worse than putting it inside the actual courtyard itself. And just because it has some walls around it, it's just like sticking it in the courtyard. You're allowed to put it in the courtyard. You're joining different courtyards together. So this shituf could be placed in a courtyard. Eruv chatzeros it's joining the houses together. The shita of Mavois is joining the courtyards together. So the courtyard, you could stick it in a courtyard. You could stick it in this guy's house. That's not that doesn't meet the minimum size of a house. Did not, because we learned in the Mishnah. Eruve chatzeros b'chatzer. You put the eruve chatzeros in the courtyard. Shitufei mavoi b'mavoi. You put the shituf of the alley in the alley. We asked the question on this. Eruve chatzeros b'chatzer. You're allowed to put the eruv of the courtyard, of the one courtyard in that courtyard. You could do that, but didn't we learn you have to put it in the house? And but we learned in the Mishnah on Hanois in a Rubai, the Beis Shar. Person puts his eruv in a Beis Shar, which is like a porch, achsadra, or this type of also a like a porch. Merpesis, or some type of a hallway, which is outside, like a corridor that's outside that you go from one, you go into different apartments. So if a person put it in these things, Eina Eruv, it's not an Eruv, and it has to be inside a house. Hadar Sham Eino Yoser, and a person who dwells there, let's say he sleeps in this on this corridor, so he doesn't prohibit the other people from from carrying, because it's not called a place of dwelling. So the Gemara says you can't put it over there. So what does it mean you can put it in the chatzer? Ela ema eruv chatzeros, the bias shabachatzer. Eruv chatzeros goes in the house inside the courtyard. Shitufay mavuos b'chatzer shabamavi, the joining of the alley, that needs to be in the chatzer, in the courtyard of the alley. So in other words, even if it's in a house that doesn't have 4x4, it's still kosher, because it could even be in the courtyard itself. The high in this house that doesn't have 4x4, like garam, it's no worse than a courtyard inside by this alley. So we'll stop here. It's 11:01. Okay, we'll stop right there. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone. Sei gesund.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, bye-bye.
Have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Yes,
Rebbe, thank
everybody.
you.
Shabbos.